Time for the Rainmaker list here. Those who maybe are just tuning in now, haven't seen the previous two, this is a list of the stages that I think are best for competitive play in Splatoon 3. That is not which stages I think are most fun to play or are best designed, look the prettiest, have the best vibes. They're the stages that I think are the most competitive, the stages that make good competitive matches, that test the skills of both teams in the ways that we value as competitive players. There are a couple of criteria that I'm looking for here, and one of them is that it has multiple routes that are viable in a good number of situations. And it's basically that, and then there's nothing else that is particularly heinous about the map design. So, not trying to force everybody and everything through a single choke point, having room to maneuver, having a good mix of high ground, low ground, having paintable walls, all of the usual suspects in Splatoon 3 map design, that none of those are getting in the way too much on this particular map. Now, as we can see on the list, there is exactly one stage, in my opinion, that meets all of my criteria for being a good tournament stage, and that is Undertow Spillway. This is, in my opinion, the only map that has two particularly viable routes to take the Rainmaker in that also doesn't fall prey to too many of the Splatoon 3 problems. The left route is easily the best part of this map. On pretty much any other mode, you have to run up the right-hand side if you want to get to the top left of the enemy's base. But in Rainmaker and Rainmaker only, for whatever reason, you can just run straight up the left side, and that opens up the map in a huge way. It makes it so that you can get legitimate flanks going. Like, you can send 3 members to the left and get a fourth unseen up the right ramp and have a full 180-degree pincer movement going on the enemy defense. Like, that's something that's actually really rare in Splatoon 3 maps, and that's super cool. The left side is kind of your slow, steady push, and then the right side is kind of your fast break push. Because right side puts you closer to the enemy spawn, making it a lot more unsafe to try and go for it in most cases. But if you are in the right side and you've just gotten a wipe, it's way faster to go for that first checkpoint than it is to go for the first checkpoint on left, and so it can be a pretty easy way to get that checkpoint out of the way, which can be really important on that map. And then after those checkpoints, the game isn't necessarily, all downhill from there. It still takes a lot of fighting to get past those first checkpoints, which is different from some of the other maps that we'll see, where once you've gotten through that first checkpoint and picked it up again, you just kind of score 40 points for free. That's not really how this map works either. It's not easy to push. There are a lot of unpaintable surfaces that you have to cross, which means you actually have to get your frontliners up into solid holding positions, and you have to clear out opponents who might be firing Trizookas at you or something. So there's a lot of possibilities for defense, but it's also not just a complete stall-fest lockout. There are offensive plays that you're capable of making, so I think it's a really solid, balanced map. The weakest part of this map, and this might be a pattern we'll point out in a couple of other places, the weakest part of this map is the middle of the map. That's why, for example, Splat Zones on Undertow is just really, really weak, and you generally don't want to play it in competitive play. And Rainmaker, as we'll see, is a mode that really de-emphasizes the middle of the map. Because as soon as one team wins a fight in neutral and gets control, it takes very little time for them to move the objective out of mid. And most of the game is going to be played outside mid. So, while that is a pretty weak area of the map, because nobody's going to want to be there anyway, because the Rainmaker will explode, and because you're going to get an advantage and then move it away from mid, it's the least weak on Rainmaker, and that makes it, I think, Undertow's strongest mode by far. Now, these next maps, again, I'm not complaining about them. I'm definitely, like, happy to play these in tournament, but there are significant issues with them that I think may make them unbalanced, or may, you know, they may lack some of the criteria that I'm looking for in the perfect tournament Rainmaker map. Now, Crab Leg, I was really considering putting up a tier. It's definitely the other one that I'm like, I could see this going in the top tier, but here are my thoughts on it. Crab Leg has a right and a left route. The right route is over high ground and over grates, and then the left route is low ground. And the high road, it's pretty easy to get the first checkpoint, but after that, it feels like such a dead end sometimes. Like, you have to advance the Rainmaker over grates, uphill, and there's uncontestable high ground basically on the upper right. Like, yes, it's in theory you could get someone up there, but you'd have to run them across the grates in full view of the enemy team. As long as they rotate decently well, they should be getting hit by Trizookas, they should be getting bombed out. Like, it's just way too easy to defend that. You can try and use something like an Inkjet to hit most of it, or like to just try and bombard them with Zookas or something, but it really feels like you hit a wall once you get up there onto the grates, and that it takes a fight elsewhere to really break things open. Like, you really need to be flanking someone around, and that's why I looked at this and I was like, I don't feel like there are actually two routes here that you want to take most of the time. The top right is great for getting first checkpoint, and then after that it feels like it just stalls out. It feels like it's a lot easier to get people over from the left-hand side and to get them into the enemy base that way, and that you really need them to be getting in position to ever be able to push anywhere else, whether you're trying to go left or right. I like how open this map is, how wide it is. It forces you to play with actual tactics instead of just guarding one singular choke point. And that's a good thing for the game, although it's kind of rare, and it forces you to play a little bit outside of what you're used to. One thing I'm also not a huge fan of is how dominant the grate positions are on this map. It feels like, honestly, ballpoint is a little too strong here. A little bit, like, too mandatory to run here for its mobility over those grates and its ability to shut down so much of the map from that position. You've just got to have an answer to a ballpoint splatling on that map. It's a little bit polarizing, and I'm not sure that I like it for its ability to control so much space compared to on other maps. So that gives it takes some marks away, but this is, in my opinion, the second best Rainmaker map in the game. Then we've got Scorch Gorge. Scorch is a really good map. The problem is the left route is just hilariously bad. It's the biggest joke, honestly, of a second checkpoint possibility in the entire game. Because going to the right, it looks like it's longer. And it is, you know, from the bird's eye view, longer. But because you have to go over grade on left, it's actually just faster to take the Rainmaker and go right and to dunk it on right than it is to dunk it on left. There is actually no reason ever to take the Rainmaker left unless they're making such a huge strategic mistake. Until once they become as aware as they will be at, you know, high level, where they're going to be seeing the Rainmaker anchor icon moving in that direction and they're just going to rotate. As soon as you get to that level of awareness at like mid-level, even like somewhat down into low level, it's just not going to work to try and out-rotate someone by going in that direction. So there's just not really a reason to run left, and so you can really, really clog up the right side, your left side on defense, their right side while they're pushing, and that makes that particular choke point a little bit kind of gross. The other thing I'm not a super huge fan of on this map, and this is across a lot of different modes, is that it goes up but then goes downhill into their base. There's Flounder. Flounder also has this problem where you get that first checkpoint, and then all of a sudden the next like 30 points or so are kind of free because they're all downhill. There's not actually anything new that you have to get control of to be able to move further forward. On Undertow, you're clawing for, every 10 points. Like, they're not great positions to run the Rainmaker from, so you actually need your frontliners to go in and do work. But as long as you weren't getting sniped by something when you went for the first checkpoint, you're probably not going to get hit by something going for the next 20 or 30 points on Scorch. So that also loses it some points in my book. Museum is a map that I really want to love. There are a lot of really good things about it. And Rainmaker is definitely by far not its worst mode. But it has a problem that is very consistent across a lot of the Splatoon 3 maps, which is just the issue of having too nasty of choke points. There are two ways, technically, to get onto the enemy plat. One being the ramp, and the other being jumping across from mid. But jumping across from mid is just way too exposed. There's no cover protecting you from that. Any kind of backline weapon, anyone with a Zuka that's watching you, it's too easy to cut that off and stop you from doing that. So you can maybe put a bucket underneath the plat and attack it from that direction, but otherwise everybody eventually has to filter through ramp unless they've wiped your team and they can bypass that choke point that way. And that sucks, because unless you have a weapon that is capable of really hard forcing your way through that choke point, which is possible against a few opponents, but not against like 3 or 4 opponents, you're forced to rely on specials. And this is what keeps happening with the metagames in Splatoon 3. It all comes back to a special being overpowered. And the problem isn't so much like in a vacuum just that special is broken, because there have been far worse specials in the history of Splatoon. The problem is that the maps make it so that you need to use whatever the most powerful special is to get through, because you don't have any other means to get you through it. You don't have the ability to flank. You don't have the ability to draw defenders out of the way with a skirmisher weapon, because there's nowhere for those skirmishers to stand. There's nowhere for them to draw people. You can just sit back and chuck bombs at this choke point and launch whatever specials you have from your high ground until they use their specials to move you out of the way. And the special of the day happens to be Trizuka. Back a while back it was Crab Tank, and same problem. This is a map that really depends on you being able to use whatever is broken to just special your way through that choke point and then figure out what you can do from there. And that's really annoying. In Clamblitz, you don't really have this problem anywhere near as much, because there's another way to the enemy basket. In fact, there's kind of a couple, in that you can jump across from mid, and you can also go over the left side block. So it spreads things out more so that you're capable as an offense of attacking the plat from enough different directions that you can sometimes get something done with the main weapons. You don't necessarily need to just hammer your way through with like multiple specials, just that one little choke point, just to get somebody up on plat and hope that they can get something done with their main weapons. In Rainmaker, it's kind of okay that it has that choke point, in that you're always going to just be throwing stuff in front of the Rainmaker anyway. That's sort of just the gameplay loop that you expect in Rainmaker. If you're not doing that, the game ends in about 11 seconds. So it's a little bit more acceptable that we have that sort of condition there. If it were the same map layout for another mode, it might feel worse. But I'm not complaining super much, because a lot of that map is pretty well balanced. It's just that one part of the map is pretty frustrating, and I don't like that it's in the game in that part of it. One more paintable wall, one more block. Like, there are so many ways that they could fix that stage with just like one change, but as it stands, I'm not willing to put it a tier up just because of that issue. Hagglefish is probably one that like has an argument to be put up a little bit higher. The thing I don't like about Hagglefish is that it's so linear. That there's very little side-to-side movement on this map. It's all like forward or back movement. And it's divided up to the point where like you can technically have flanks in that someone's pushing through the right or left closed and then coming up behind the rest of the enemy team that are looking at mid. But those are really predictable. You just know those are the only ways that someone can flank, and so you're just going to have someone watching those. And it's a high enough level, they tend to get cut off pretty reliably until you make a really serious team macro tactical play. You've got to really draw people out. You've got to put a bunch of pressure on. And this map, too, just tends to kind of boil down to who bullies through middle with specials the best. Once you're through into the enemy court, this feels like a great map. You have multiple options. You can go to the middle checkpoint and try to jump it across, or you could go to middle checkpoint and then try to take it up the switchback. Both of those are pretty solid options for getting points, for getting frontliners in front of you first. You can also try to take the mix-up and go left and see if you can bait someone into dropping. There are a lot of different interesting tactical ideas. All of those routes can be viable. So if we ignore mid, I think that this is a great map and it deserves to be up higher. But mid being this awkward stalemate where you don't have a lot of room to maneuver and you're just kind of stuck watching your angle until someone screws up, that's the part of it that I don't like. And that's why I put it down a little bit. But it's still totally a map that should be on tournament map lists. Like, it's one of the best ones we've got. Mako Mart is up there pretty far as well, too. Like, honestly, I probably put these a little bit higher. Maybe even... Yeah, you know what? I'm going to put these at the top of this tier. Because these two are pretty good. Mako Mart is a little bit skinny, and that's, always been the one critique that I have of it. But the verticality segments the map pretty well so that you do kind of have to move up one little bit at a time. No one part of the map feels too attackable or too defendable. They're generally pretty well balanced. Depends on you winning fights the whole way forward. The right side is sometimes occasionally a viable option. And this is the main reason that it's down here and not at the very top, because I would like for the right and left side to be viable at least a significant amount of the time. Usually, if you're going right side, you're going for that first checkpoint, but you're probably not going to get that much further, and you're just trying to kind of charge in and go for points afterward if you've got any more time. It is the faster route of the two, but you land right next to the enemy spawn. And so having the first checkpoint be right there, you have to dunk it, which means you have to give the enemy team time to respawn, and then they're just going to have high ground over you, and they're going to be able to bomb out that narrow choke point you've got to push through. So left side is often really the only viable long-term pushing option. Like if you're really trying to go in and go for it, and you've got time and you're trying to set this up and maybe have like multiple Rainmaker carries to get you all the way, that's pretty much the only way you ever want to go. And I wish that there were a little bit more complexity to it. You can really only go right if you've basically wiped the enemy team or they're out of position. Otherwise, they lock that down too hard. And so a little bit less complex than it probably could be, but still a pretty solid choice. Manta Maria, the part that I don't like about this, mid is great. Mid is, you've got multiple different options. You've got a lot of different factors to consider when you're pushing in either different direction. Like both right and left are like almost entirely dependent on the defensive formation, whether you want to go one way or another. They're both pretty good, and they both see like pretty close to equal use, which is unusual for first checkpoints. What I don't like is that they both narrow down into exactly the same path to the goal afterward, and that path is just so stally, but also so momentum heavy. It's like really short, And if you get a clean wipe or something, it's just game over from there. But if you don't get that clean wipe, it stalls out forever, and there's no cover to move you forward, so it's really hard to get the rest of the way there, and it kind of becomes a stall fest at that point. So that later end of it feels like you lose a lot of the tactical depth. Like, all of the tactical depth is, how do I flank them to get the defenders out of the way, rather than where can I move the Rainmaker? Because the Rainmaker's got a pretty linear path that it has to travel. Not a lot of cover to get there either. Humpback is one of the biggest choke points in the entire game. The elbow on the right side of Humpback is this classic Splatoon 2 stall location where you get to that first checkpoint area. There wasn't a first checkpoint in S2, but you get to that area with the Rainmaker, and then LDE bomb spam, inkjets, all over the place, missiles. You have to pop armor just to have a chance of getting through. It can easily stay there for 30, 45 seconds before anything happens, because it's just so hard to push through that choke point. In Splatoon 3, there are fewer specials that are quite as good at just stalling for a long time in that choke point, or really hammering your way through. But Zuka is a pain in the butt on that map. It's such a narrow passageway you have to go through that it's easy to get doubles and even triples from just firing a Zuka at the right time. So, very perilous. And there is a flank, which does give it points, and sometimes that flank can be really impactful. But the flank is so far away that a lot of the time you're basically rolling the dice when you go for that flank. You're basically like, I have no idea whether this is going to work. I have no way of knowing whether they're going to see this. I have no way of knowing how well they're going to respond to this. I have no way of knowing who I'm going to draw over, because in order to get to that left flank in time, I have to be going there while everyone on the enemy team is already down. So I'm not going to be able to react to anything that they do, because I need to be going to that flank before they're even out on the map again. So that part of it isn't great. That said, fighting over mid is great. It's a very wide map, which makes it so that there's a lot more tactical depth. There's a lot more potential to flank and sneak up on someone. There's a lot more different directions you have to watch, and it's a much better test of whether you can play the game tactically than just, can I throw fizzy bombs into choke point? And that gives it a lot of points in my book. And also, I have a soft spot because it is one of the best inkjet maps in the game, and I think inkjet is awesome. So therefore, it goes up in not complaining instead of would rather not. Then Barnacle and Dime. This map can snowball really hard, especially once the enemy team gets into your base, because the biggest problem with this map is just that a lot of the time the high ground in your base favors the enemy team. It's too easy to get them a lockout state because the map is too narrow and there are too few options to maneuver in it. So you lock out a few particular choke points and all of a sudden there's not a lot the enemy team can do, and they're out of options. It's a map that you lose very quickly compared to other maps. I do think that the checkpoint is in a pretty good place, and I do think that it gives a decent variety of options for how to approach that checkpoint. You can approach that checkpoint from the right, you can approach it from the left. Once you get through first checkpoint, you can go up the steps on the right, you can go over the glass on the left, you can play a little bit slower on the far left side. There are some options, and I think that is, like, considering how narrow the map is, it's actually surprisingly good how well it's laid out, but the narrowness still does make it so that it has a lot of weaknesses, and I would never put it much higher than not complaining, I think, on any list until there are major reworks to it that fix that. Okay, next up is Would Rather Not. These maps, again, if they're on a map list, a tournament map list, I'm not looking at that like, what are these people thinking? I'm just like, definitely not my favorite. Inkblot, I think the weakest mode by far is Rainmaker, and that's because, unlike in other modes, there's only one way onto the enemy plat, and it's the route that the Rainmaker has to take. And there is, in theory, you know, after you get first checkpoint, a second way to get to the other checkpoint, but that way just sucks because it's longer, and it's also putting you closer to the enemy spawn, and it's also like more dangerous in general because you're giving the enemy team more sightlines on the Rainmaker. You should basically just never push bats with the Rainmaker. And so the fact that the Rainmaker path is so linear makes this pretty lame to play. Much rather have... if you put like a second option for the first checkpoint on like maybe the right side of plat, and you put cutback in there, and maybe you move the final goal a little bit higher up into the base or something, I could see that being like an S tier map. But just the way that it's laid out is not conducive to putting the Rainmaker checkpoints in good places. Eeltail Rainmaker I like a lot more than most of the Eeltail modes because of the mobility that you get around the map. You get a ramp into the enemy base that's not there in the other modes, which really should be there because that is best used by the defenders as a way to back up if they overcommit into their own pit. The fact that they don't have that is actually more dangerous to them, when I think the intent of taking away that ramp was to make it more difficult to spawn camp, and that's just not how it really works. It makes it easier to spawn camp because now they can't drop out of spawn because there's no ramp to get back up. So that part has sucked, and it's not there. In Rainmaker, they kept the ramp there because that's an important way to be able to get to the goal, which is important. You also have more access to the right side of the bridge as the attacking team on this version of the map than you do in other modes, besides like tower control, which is also awesome. That's something that I wish were just a feature on all of the different Eeltail modes. That would be a huge help. It is still a little bit too narrow, and that will always take it down and make it just a little bit too easy to play the choke points. But it also does have the benefit of both of the checkpoints being pretty viable routes and like right and left being seen, you know, pretty commonly. So there's a lot that's going right here. Like as far as Eeltail goes, this is one of its better maps. And if they run Eeltail Rainmaker at a tournament, like I'm not complaining too much about that. It's just, it's still Eeltail, and I have to knock it down a little bit for that. Umami has a very similar problem to Barnacle, which is that the map is just straight up too narrow, and so it's very snowbally or very stally. There's no real in-between. There's not a lot of tactical depth to how you get through. You kind of just have to bull rush your way through everything, and if you can't do that, then the game is just going to last a long time and not a lot of progress is going to be made, and you're going to be chucking things at each other for a while. The reason that I put Barnacle higher is that I really like the middle of Barnacle. I think like up until the point where you reach about the first checkpoint area, Barnacle and Dime is a really well-designed map with a lot of different routes to move around in. With Umami, it's sort of the Hagglefish school of design where there's the middle, where everyone is vulnerable, and then there's the two hallways where you watch out for the flanking options. And it's too easy to put someone in a position to watch at least two of those at once. So it's very difficult to clear your way through mid. Wahoo. Wahoo is another map that, like, if not for one area of it, would be one or even two areas higher. The problem with this map is that it's hourglass shaped, that it pinches really hard in the middle, and it's hard to get through the middle. If the bridges were always available in mid, then I would bump this at least a tier up. If the middle of the map were just generally wider, I would probably bump it up twice. But it's too hard to get through mid, it's too hard to get control of mid, it becomes a bit of a stall fest around mid. As soon as you clear mid, it becomes very interesting, because you have multiple routes to take, And both of those routes double as strong flank routes to support a push on the opposite side. But there's also a lot of defensive high ground, so it's not something you're just going to get steamrolled through. Lots of really interesting possibilities for a variety of different weapon classes here. It's just the middle of the map needs a lot of work. Sturgeon, it's really solid on a lot of modes, but I think the Rainmaker version in Splatoon 3 is a significant step down from what it was in Splatoon 2. It makes the push forward a lot more linear than it used to be. You do have the new choice to go between street and jumping up over the right, which is nice, but getting up out of court, well, you know, you get down into court and get that first checkpoint, and then getting back up is worse than it's felt before. And the left side push, it's very dependent on whether the bridge is up, and that can stall out for a pretty long time just because of the bridge not being up. So it's often just a poor option to choose, especially if you don't have control far in front of the left side block. If that left side block is watched by even one person, you can hold off like 2 or 3 members of the enemy team by yourself by just painting that block and preventing the jump from happening. So the left side doesn't feel great. The right side, you don't have quite as many options for getting up as the frontliner ahead of the Rainmaker as you used to. So there are a couple of improvements here, but I think on the whole it's generally worse than it used to be. Ship shape. Ship shape is not a bad map overall, but the problem is that in Rainmaker in particular, for one thing, the left side push is almost as bad as the Scorched Gorge left side push. It's slower. It's not really safer. The enemy team is still going to be able to hit you with their long-range weapons from there. And the thing is, they can defend that side of the map from positions. They can also defend the other side of the map. So you're not even forcing them to rotate by going left. You're just making yourself more vulnerable as you push up. The middle route is pretty much the only way that I ever see anybody go. And if you go that way uncontested, it only takes something like, I think, like 6 seconds to get from the middle of the map all the way to the final goal if you just swim from one place to the other. Now, naturally, that's not going to happen because things are going to be in the way. But if you get that first checkpoint and then you score a wipe, it should just be game over from the middle of the map. It's too easy to get there. It's too fast. And they make it, you know, miserable in terms of the high ground that you have to fight against to get through there. And that trench on the way to the final goal is absolutely a kill zone if there's anybody watching it. But also there's the threat that if they do get through there, then the game just immediately ends. And it's really hard to defend because dropping out of spawn, you can't actually get straight to the goal there. You often have to just like watch as they walk up, never have any shots, and they dunk it, and you're swimming toward it, and you can't do anything about it. And that doesn't feel great. So I think that the Rainmaker layout here, there's not a lot more they could have done with it without making major changes to the map itself, but it doesn't feel well designed for it, and I think it's one of the weaker ship shape modes. Brine Water is very one-dimensional, and it loses points for that. The one thing that I do like a lot about this is that it doesn't fall prey to the issues that they have with verticality on something like Flounder, which we'll talk about next, where you, because of the way that high ground works, you're sometimes getting advantage as the attacking team the further in you go. Scorched Gorge has this problem in Tower, has this problem a lot less so in Rainmaker. I believe that like as a Rainmaker push goes ahead, it should get harder and harder to hold on to the push. It should become more difficult. It should become more defensible the higher up you get towards the final goal. And Brine Water is actually a map where that is the case, where you are having to push uphill constantly. And the higher uphill you get, the closer you get to defensive high ground that's really easy for them to use to stop you. That's a good thing about this map, and that's something that's really praiseworthy in the design of it. Scorched Gorge has a very similar case where, yes, after the first checkpoint, you go downhill, and those first few points are probably pretty free, but then you have to go all the way up an ascent into the enemy side that's pretty undefended on the way. And having to fight that hard to get those points is actually a really good design element. So that part is really good about Scorch. It's just the part after the first checkpoint that's weak there. And Brinewater doesn't even have that problem. But the problem with Brinewater is there's only one way to go. It's pretty predictable, and you just kind of bully your way through with whatever the strong thing is at the time. Crab tanks were disgusting on this map. This is a map that's pretty strong for E-Leader, and you know what I feel about maps that are strong for E-Leader. This is a map where, like, you could probably run a tent to some effect, because there just aren't that many different directions to attack the objective line from. There aren't a lot of really great flank routes. And so, because of how linear it is, it drops it down a lot in my book. Okay. These next maps I don't think should be on tournament map lists. If they get put on there, I'm disagreeing, but I'm also not like, what are these TOs thinking? It's more like, I would rather not see this again. So, there aren't a lot of Rainmaker maps that I'm really in love with in this game, but there also aren't a lot that I think are really dreadful. And that is to the game's credit at the very least. Flounder Heights, we talked about this a little bit. Middle of the map is fine. Problem is, in Rainmaker, like we mentioned earlier in the video, the middle of the map is not the part that matters the most for the design being good. It is the part after mid where you're trying to make a push towards the checkpoints. And the first checkpoint, first of all, I like where it is on the right side. The left side is kind of wacky because it's total bait. In solo queue, everyone's always going to go for this, and then they're going to realize, wait, this actually isn't safe. And also, because I went for it, our push is now dead. Because you're giving up all of the high ground. What you see a lot more often, especially among coordinated teams, is they want to go for the right checkpoint if they can, and then use the high ground to get themselves the rest of the way down. Because once you get that first checkpoint on the right, now you can just, put a Zuka up at the top, or a Crab Tank up at the top, or, Inkjet, or whatever else, and you have the high ground over the defenders. They don't have a great way of contesting you with their main weapons. They have to be using, like, bombs or specials or something, and those bombs or specials or whatever are going to make them more visible to someone who's using the high ground to shoot them from above from places that are really hard for frontliners to contest. So you get to that first checkpoint, and then again, just like in the Scorched Gorge, it's like 35 points after that, or 40 points after that, are kind of just free once you get your opening, and everyone's going to sit up there and stall until that happens. Couple that with the fact that the left side feels like it's kind of bait sometimes, and it just feels like the game plan on this map is not particularly fun to play. Mahi Rainmaker would have been lower on the earlier build, but the fact that they made the whole map bigger and gave you a few more options for moving the Rainmaker around, while still, again, very funneled into choke points, they're a lot more playable now. The first checkpoint on the right side being further down makes that a much more viable choice to go for, because it's going to be faster to get that way a lot of the time now, and that makes it desirable to try and attack, which means that you need to defend more than just the right-hand side if you're on the defending team. You need to defend more than just the ramp. You actually have to watch that left side, because they could just blitz it and get that checkpoint and then have permanent progress unlocked for having done it. You can't just LDE bomb spam the right side and expect to stop them from getting first checkpoint indefinitely. So that much is nicer, and that gets it a little bit higher. It is still Mahi. It is still too small. I will stand by this. This was a map that, in its original design would have been better for 2v2s than it was for 4v4s. Now it's better, but it still has a lot of nasty choke points and not enough cover, and I still think that it's one of the weaker maps in the entire game. Hammerhead has a different kind of problem. Hammerhead's middle of the map is great, and again, middle of the map is the part that's least emphasized in Rainmaker because you're more often going to be trying to get it to one side of mid or another. Usually you win a fight, and then the Rainmaker is past mid before the next fight happens, regardless of where that took place. So it's rare that you have to play the neutral from the strongest part of the map, and the weakest part of the map is the part that you have to push into. Now, it does have the benefit, the brine water good thing, which is that you have to push uphill. You have to push, and it gets harder as you push up. Except that if you do get like a clean wipe or something, this snowballs out of control. Because the high ground as you push up is a little bit too accessible to the enemy team and a little bit too predictable. There are only so many places they're going to be able to move where they can even see the Rainmaker as it moves forward. And if you just have a Trizuka ready for the first person who pops their head up over the top of that wall, it can be a little bit too fast of a snowball. This is a map where people tend to KO and KO pretty quickly once they get some kind of advantage, even though it is one of the longer maps. And part of that is because it's too skinny. Part of that is because there aren't enough ways out of spawn, which I guess kind of comes from it being too skinny. So the fact that so much of the map is going to play out on the weakest part of Hammerhead, the part of Hammerhead that really sucks, the Walleye Warehouse part of Hammerhead, makes this pretty weak, and it puts it very close to the Walleye Warehouse threshold, which is where we find Mincemeat. I don't think Rainmaker is as miserable as like its Splat Zones or Clamblitz versions. This variant, there are some ways forward that can work, unlike on Zones or Clamblitz. Like, on offense on Zones or Clamblitz, there's just not a way forward. Even with specials, sometimes you pop a special, and unless it gets disproportionate value, more value than usual, you probably still haven't earned your way forward. Here, it's a little bit different. It is really hard to pick the Rainmaker up in the first place. It's up on the grates, and the pop doesn't really get you any value, so there's not even that much of an incentive to fight over it. You really need to splat someone first. Once you can get the Rainmaker down on the ground, though, it almost feels like a Rainmaker map again. The problem that I have with it is just how difficult it is to get any pressure on the enemy plat. The only way up is either to do the really full, hard right flank that gets you all the way to the enemy spawn before you can come back to the plat, or to put someone over the left great bridge, which is the only other place they're really going to have to look for the entire game. As long as they can defend those two places, nobody ever gets to contest plat, and the Rainmaker is just always going to be on low ground against someone trying to defend against it. So AoE weapons can help, but that part really hurts as the attacking team and makes this play a lot slower. But it's, at least you got two ways into the plat that sometimes you can sneak somebody into. And if you're able to do that, then maybe you're going to be able to lock the enemy team out. But the neutral game is still absolutely as miserable as it always is on Mincemeat. Everyone is e-liter food. It's just the one of the only ways across is by using a tent umbrella, because you're just going to be bombarded constantly for trying to exist in mid anywhere. It's miserable for frontline weapons, so they have to resort to their specials and bombs, which is the worst of the game. You want a map that forces you to play with your main weapon and gives you opportunities to use it, rather than maps that say, you don't get to do that, because if you do that, you die. Therefore, just sit and paint the ground for 12 seconds, get a special, and then hope that that special does something that your team can move off. And then move through the map using all the cool movement tools and the main weapons that we made that are really fun, with the sole purpose of being able to skip as much of the map as you possibly can, instead of fighting on that part of the map, so that you don't have to fight your way through it with the specials again. Definitely, I think the worst Rainmaker map in the entire game, but one of Mincemeat's stronger modes, actually, in terms of comparing it to the others. So, those are my opinions. As I've said before, these are much more my opinions than they are, I think, some synthesis of what other people in the community think. So there's a lot of this that I'm sure plenty of players better than me, analysts better than me, will disagree with. But I like kind of starting these conversations so that we can be thinking about them and what makes a map good in making our own tournament map lists. So let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you for the Clam Blitz one to finish off the series.